Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. And we'll try to move through this quickly. There are a lot of slides to cover. My research and teaching interests include world citizenship education, moral education and identity, psychology of early learning, the unconscious learning and unconscious bias that we all have, model building and curriculum design, and teacher training, particularly in diversity training and oneness. And you'll see some of these themes reflected in my presentation. Let darkness of racism, xenophobia, and genocide be dispelled, and let the tempest of discord be stilled, and the peoples of the world find rest. All people have one common destiny and are forever independent. Let us be united so that we can build a world community and a world civilization in peace. Let us see ourselves clearly with 2020 vision in the year 2020. I want to look at how we would reverse engineer peace. If we have to think about it, peace depends upon unity. Unity depends on a willingness to build that unity in the world. And building unity comes from a sense of responsibility to do it in the first place. World citizenship is that sense of responsibility. World citizenship is a superordinate identity, and this identity depends upon a perception of oneness. The consciousness of oneness of humanity depends on an understanding of the realities of what a human being is and understanding the profound interconnection of all living systems in our global environment. Oneness is the stage where we are today. We are in need of a perception of identity based on a science of education, or a science in general. Who do you think you are? Identity and self-interest widen with a more accurate perception of one's world. You're identified with your family, of course, your tribe, or your nation, your city, perhaps, your religion, your culture, and ultimately you can be identified with the entire population of the planet. And as these loyalties, as these circles of unity expand, we get a greater sense of loyalty and belonging to the wholeness of humanity. Who are we? I want to propose a paradigm shift for education. I want schools to constantly remind children how they came to exist, to see one life process, and to see the oneness and connectedness of all people. Everything starts from nothing. Everything was created from nothing. With a great vision, we can create a new world. We've heard this old saying, without a grand vision, the people perish. Out of utter nothingness, the creation was called into being, infinite in its range and deathless in its duration. How could sheer nothingness have acquired by itself the worthiness and capacity to emerge from its state of non-existence into the realm of being? The earth is our home, invisible in the vastness of space. This is where we are, all the earth's people together. The earth is fragile. Life is fragile. We must care for each other to ensure survival and know that we are one people. We're the flowers of one garden. We're the waves of one sea. We are the leaves of one tree. Scientists and religionists agree that in the beginning of the universe there was nothing, and then there was light, creating everything. Light is a symbol for knowledge and truth in our enlightened age. Let's let light continue to guide us. Let's not be seduced by suspicion and imitation. With love and hope, themes of this conference, let us work and seek the knowledge to build unity and peace on earth. Those are our major themes. Respecting all cultures and humbling ourselves before the grand design, let us recognize oneness and protect our common future. Ignorance is darkness. Knowledge is light. One planet, one people, please. Let us live as one. I'd really titled this talk, Teaching the Oneness of Humanity to Humanity. And I am going to imply that this will require a spiral curriculum. That's my thesis. Soon, we have to do this if we're going to survive. And this presentation is a proposal and an invitation to create a network of educators around the world. I'm inviting you to help us install a new science-based conceptual framework for schools to help humanity shift the paradigm from otherness to oneness consciousness. I'll provide an email to you at the end so that you can contact me if you're wanting to work with me in some way. I've just now mentioned the high goal, and I must share how I think we can achieve it, except first, according to the I Ching or Zhou, dangers, problems, and evils must be pointed out plainly in the beginning before explaining the high goal to the people. Therefore, let us now be aware of the dangers and darkness that surround us, dangers that keep us from reaching our goal. Light shines brighter in a dark place. Darkness and light define each other. So a closer look at the darkness may actually help us understand the fundamentals underlying our worst problems and make us realize what we need to do. All nations must work together to address these global problems: aging, health, and world population, natural disasters, floods, drought, earthquakes, asteroids, etc., hunger, poverty, unemployment, and disease, global pandemics, environmental degradation, drastic climate change, control of insecticides, extinction of ocean and land species, deforestation, soil loss, etc. Large and small conflicts among national, ethnic, and religious groups, global arms race, nuclear war and terrorism, rogue states, their nations, the clash of civilizations and ideologies, xenophobia, jingoism, racism, cyber warfare, artificial intelligence and its weapons technology, competition for the natural resources of the planet, waste disposal, economic warfare and economic burden of military expenditures, espionage, world economy, energy supplies, technology and fair trade, migration, displaced populations, genocide, slavery, sex trade and abuse, growth hormones, poison, GMO complications in the food chain. Many of these cannot be solved, and they will require continuous control and management, perhaps indefinitely, implying a really close working relationship among all nations. Often these global problems do not seem to concern us directly, and until they begin to hurt us directly, we don't often think about them. Also, the consequences of one problem often bring on other problems. The example of the COVID virus has had far-reaching consequences beyond the spread of the disease itself. The pandemic's causing the largest global recession in history, with more than a third of the global population being in lockdown. We need greater global cooperation. University professor Jeffrey Sachs, one of the world's leading economists, has written, "I think the US-China relations are so vital for the world that it's extremely important to set a place in a thorough and high-level, extensive and serious interaction between the two countries." Between the US and China, the world is at stake. The US and China are the leading nations, and together they can lead. Remember where we are. The Earth came out of nothingness with infinite possibilities. We can create a new Earth out of new possibilities. We must create a new world if we wish to survive. We talk about sustainability as really survivability, but we need an inspiring vision of a possibility. Who do you think you are? I've already shown this once. Your self-interest widens as you increase your circle of unity. But until we reach this largest circle of unity on the planet, these isolated bonds of unity are also what cause disunity and segregate people, although ultimately they need not divide us in future if we recognize we are one. A few of our world leaders and rulers seem to understand this, at least in their rhetoric. President Xi calls for world citizenship in these words: "We call on the peoples of all countries to work together to build a community with a shared future for mankind, to build an open, inclusive, clean, and beautiful world that enjoys lasting peace, universal security, and common prosperity." China champions the development of a world community and has encouraged the evolution of a global governance system. That was in his speech to the 19th Congress in 2017. These words of President Xi represent a perfect vision and aspiration for humanity. And now we must find the means to transform these words into actions that will make the vision a reality, a shared future And common prosperity means we must see that all the people on the planet are part of one life system. We are one people. World citizenship education is clearly the biggest educational task for all. For millenniums of history have conditioned men to think in terms of smaller and more exclusive units, while suspicion and hostility toward other groups lie deep within their patterns of thought. This is from Harvard professor Edwin Reischauer, who was the former ambassador to Japan after World War II. Humanity is gripped by a crisis of identity. We've been living with our us and them mentality for generations. Us and them mentality equals us and them mortality. We have this crisis of identity, identifying the human race into these different blocks based on color and ethnicity. The world has a false perception that we are different peoples, different races, despite the fact that science proves we are all one people, one human race. This us and them mentality has been responsible for over 100 million deaths in the last 80 years. Soviet Union, China, Germany, Poland, you can see the numbers. I'll go through them quickly. I won't take time to read them. But you can see some of them are shocking. Most Americans don't know that 10 million Chinese civilians died in World War II. They talk about the Jewish Holocaust of about 6 million, but don't realize China even suffered more. And Africa has suffered 15 million. Our normal state of alienation, this represents our state of alienation from one another, this us and them perception mentality. So-called normal men have killed perhaps 100 million of their fellow normal men in the last 80 years. And these numbers only represent our time, our enlightened and civilized era, which thinks it's come of age, not the jingoism of previous millennia, leading back to antiquity and its destruction of entire civilizations. We have met the enemy, and he is us. Reischauer also said, developing an emotional sense of world citizenship is clearly the biggest educational task of all, a clear necessity for human survival in the 21st century, and it must be spread throughout the whole population, and the time period within which this must be done may be very short. The emotional sense, he says, of world citizenship must come from a perception of oneness, which is much more than a conception of oneness. Perception grants emotion. This perception can be learned in the same manner all perception is learned, and I'll talk about that in a moment. It comes from deep understanding. Perception depends on our understanding. I'll also need to define and examine these concepts in a moment: spiral curriculum, conception, perception, emotion, oneness. That emotion wants to be described in an emotional sense, or the sense of oneness. We have an unprecedented opportunity to see ourselves as citizens of planet Earth. COVID-19 and its consequences have increased the recognition of the oneness of humanity because it has taught the peoples of the world to view things internationally and interdependently. Most people on the planet now understand that interdependence of all the Earth's peoples is an absolute fact. They see it in a whole new light because it's become so real to all of us. Yet we have more to learn. This is the providential blessing hidden inside the global catastrophe, because the obvious and basic challenge in the world is for the people to cooperate and live together. And we've had to do that on a modest level anyway. So it's a blessing in disguise, we might say. The Chinese word for crisis signifies an opportunity accompanying the danger. Those two terms together come together. A number of analysts have discovered that opportunities are created by this crisis, and you can look for them on the web under blessing in disguise. You can Google that, or silver lining plus COVID-19. The problem will be to get people to retain the commitment to world citizenship once the crisis and the window of opportunity is passed. The evidence shows that the only way for people to have achieved the emotional sense of world citizenship identity is to have understood deeply their connection to everybody else, everyone else. So they feel the sense of commitment and loyalty to the human race and to its betterment. It will require a special kind of education for them to know their oneness in an outward sense. that they share with everyone else. So after recognizing the oneness of humanity, world citizenship can become an identity, and a sense of responsibility is attained. This should also help most people to love others. The Chinese word for crisis signifies danger and opportunity. Okay, we've seen that. Somehow the slide's not working right. Is this pandemic a portent or a portal? Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their new world, a new world. This one's no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. And we can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our hatred for one another, our dead ideas, our dead bodies, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through, ready to imagine another world. We choose which door. This is from Arundhati Roy, and this was a quote in the Financial Times. Is COVID-19 and its attendant and consequent crises a harbinger of worse things to come, or a gateway through which we can pass into another world? The choice may be ours. That's right. It may be that we get to choose whether we use this catastrophe as a portal or wait for some subsequent apocalypse we are inviting through our ignorance of the cooperation that can be ours if we choose. Can we imagine a new world of unity and begin building it before it's too late? Many old systems that are in self-destruct mode can kill us. The big opportunity for us in this time of crisis is that people all over the world now understand how interdependent and interconnected we are, and that we must have a greater cooperation among the nations and peoples of the world. From working with schools around the world, I believe people are ready to accept the responsibilities of world citizenship. They've already accepted world citizenship in concept. In concept. However, a conception is not enough. The emotional sense, based on a perception of oneness, is needed. How do we get that? Crisis of identity, us and them. Let us attempt to discuss a pragmatic solution to this real world problem. Let's tackle this big one. If we can agree what is humanity's greatest challenge, then perhaps we can agree on what to do about it. COVID-19 and the protests around the world have shed new light on our greatest challenges, letting us see we're challenged by the us and them mentality and our prosperity for treating others badly. I'm not discussing the philosophical nature of evil, but rather man's inhumanity to man. We are neurobiologically wired for prejudice while absorbing cultural bias that comes into us from all around us all the time. It's evident that humanity cannot deal with its global problems without greater cooperation, and that the us and them mentality is standing in our way. Our history of us versus them has not been very good. Remember where we are. We live on an insignificant speck of dust floating in the vastness of space, but the cosmos will not miss us if we disappear. Our problems have become too great for a single nation alone, or even a few nations together, to solve them. We must see our interdependence and work together, or we all perish together. Looking back at the past, history is our story. What's our most fundamental problem? There's going to be some photos here that are rather graphic and can be disturbing. You may want to avert your eyes. This was the slaughter of American Indians in the United States, a beautiful people. Europe and Asian wars, slavery around the world. There are even about 36 million slaves today. Here's one America hasn't dealt with, really. There's a lot of denial, even without having adequately grieved for the Civil War. There were 51,000 soldiers killed in Virginia in one day during the Civil War, more than the total number of Americans killed in Vietnam in 11 years. That was the Battle of Gettysburg in Virginia. Of course, we know World War II and the Holocaust of the Jews. Nagasaki, Hiroshima, those are photographs of the actual bombs that were dropped there, where 50,000 died in 1 second and 92,000 died in another second. The scientist responsible for helping invent this bomb said, "I am become death." the destroyer of worlds. That's a quote from the Bhagavad Gita, Hindu Bible. And in America, more than 4,000 black Americans were lynched by white Americans between 1865 and 1965. Mostly prosperous blacks were targets of white lynch mobs. The civil rights movement began in the 60s, but continues to be a problem even today for the disunity of Americans. Some of our leaders were assassinated, as you know, Bobby Kennedy, Malcolm X, John Kennedy, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Breaking the White Barrier. This is a painting my mother did. I just made a list of all these racial classes over the last 160 years. All the people who were killed in different cities in the United States and some in Europe. Perhaps the one that was most graphic, because we all got to watch it on television, were the killing fields of Vietnam and Cambodia, really illustrating man's inhumanity to man, civilians massacred in some cases. Rwanda, we had 800,000 people slaughtered in 90 days while the world stood by and just let it happen. South Africa, same problem. And now our cities burn from the same us and them mentality. But people are awake. They're getting off their couches. You can see now it's time to change the world. The new racists are proud to promote the fears of white genocide and replacement. This is the old eugenics conversation. You can see this. But it goes back, this separation of humanity, the signs of disunity with the walls of yesterday, the walls of today, in Israel and Palestine and Mexico, all generated by suspicion, fear, and hostility. And now we live in a digital age with digital walls breaking down. Suspicion, fear, hostility, forms of espionage, cyber warfare, military weaponry, artificial intelligence, computer technology. Stephen Hawking, one of the greatest scientists of our time, said that artificial intelligence has become the greatest threat to peace and security in the world, and this amplifies our false sense of us and them. Millenniums of history and culture have conditioned men to think in terms of smaller, more exclusive units than being part of the whole of humanity, while suspicion and hostility toward other groups lie deep within their patterns of thought. Well, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about ourselves to overcome ourselves? Our culture constantly bombards us with worn-out interpretations of reality. Here's a quote from one of the leading cultural anthropologists of our time. Culture and the socialization process is dictatorial unless it's not that man must be in sync with or adapt to his culture, but that cultures grow out of sync with the reality of man and his new potential for newly heightened awareness. And when this happens, people go crazy and they don't know it. In order to avoid mass insanity, people must learn to transcend and adapt their culture to the times and to their biological organisms. Now, I didn't know what that meant at first until I began to study the brain science. And if you look at it in terms of how the brain works, we really do have to adapt the culture to how the brain works, because it can either kill us or save us. That was Edward T. Hall in his book, Beyond Culture. So we have this concept or the goal of the great harmony, which is unity and diversity. Confucius proposed, oh gosh, so long ago, it's been in the Chinese culture forever. Within 4 seas, all men are brothers. This is a simple and yet very profound statement. But is this noble ideal a conception or is it a perception? Is this great learning a conception or a perception? Beautiful and true statements like this one from Confucius are not enough to change the world. But why not? Because if you do not already have the intuitive sense of this truth, it's just a concept, just an idea. Even those who embrace it may have only an intellectual assent to this idea with no emotional commitment. It can be a mere platitude. An emotional commitment is required. That's why not. That's why these platitudes are not sufficient. They're not sufficient to change the world. Concept is not an emotion nor a perception. Although accurate knowledge and concepts are essential to develop healthy emotions and can sometimes evoke feelings if we deeply understand these concepts. Bottom line is human beings are motivated by emotions, feelings, and perceptions more than they are motivated by concepts and ideas. Emotions motivate us. And this is so basic, every classroom teacher knows this. Even the best science metaphors are not enough to give us the emotional sense of oneness with other human beings. This aspen forest in the United States is the largest single living organism on the planet. And although the trees appear as individuals, they come from the same root system and they are genetically identical. In truth, they are one reality, one identity, one entity. This metaphor is beautiful and true, but not enough to rewire our brains away from the unconscious cultural biases programmed into us for generations. Using the new brain science, what we're trying to gain is an emotional sense as a perception. I want to be able to see other people as the same as myself and not have to think about how different they are. A reorientation of education so as to give young people everywhere a sense of the shared interests and basic oneness of mankind, and to prepare them for effective participation as members of a world community is, I believe, a clear necessity for human survival in the 21st century. This again is Edwin Reichout, a Harvard professor and ambassador to Japan after World War II. The principle underlying world citizenship identity is the recognition of oneness, and he's saying that here. That's what's needed. This is a clear necessity for human survival, he says. So this emotional sense of us and them, what we have now, is in great contrast to this emotional sense of oneness and world citizenship, what we need. How to get there is the big question. To transform this emotional sense of separation and exclusion of others, we must try to understand how the neurological mechanism by which an emotional sense is generated. There's a breakthrough, a scientific discovery in brain science. Networks in the brain, which we now call emotional networks, are processing knowledge unconsciously, making most of our decisions for us unconsciously. And these decisions result in actions that reflect our prejudices, our assumptions, our interpretations, and our biases. This comes from a number of leading neurobiologists, neuroscientists. The simple process of speaking is the most common example of unconscious processing. If you want to think about what unconscious processing is, you do not have to think about every word you're going to say. Your words are chosen for you unconsciously based on your understanding of the idea that you want to convey. Unconscious understanding is the mysterious key to all unconscious bias and behavior. It grants the emotional sense of things for us. This emotional sense is our most important sense or perception. It's the mysterious key to all unconscious bias and behavior, whether it's positive or negative. It all comes from how we understand and the knowledge base that's built up in our memory and our associations from the past. Similar to prejudice, our emotions escape our discernment. Each neuron has approximately 10,000 other neurons connected to it. Our brain is amazing. Leading neuroscientist Antonio Damasio and colleagues have called the unconscious decision-making process in the brain emotions. This is a relabel of a familiar term, so we have to think deeply about what they're talking about. It's not what we've thought about. They're extensions of our survival mechanisms, which have evolved to keep us alive. We even know animals have it. Even insects, they say, have what they're calling this neurological basis for emotion. It's a neurological mechanism. The word no longer represents feelings, which are now defined by them as that state when the emotions come into our conscious awareness. This is a human reality. These scientists speak of the feeling of emotion, which is uniquely human. Surprisingly, emotions make most of our decisions for us every day, unconsciously. They neurologically attempt to balance homeostasis and try to ensure our behaviors for survival. They also make decisions for us, selecting food in the marketplace. They found that people with aphasia have had brain damage, brain injuries to this area where the emotions cannot function, can't make simple decisions in the grocery store. It's amazing. So the emotional system emerges into consciousness as decisions and as feelings. And this is where they become perceptible in our daily lives. Otherwise, they're invisible. Emotions are beneath the threshold of consciousness. Only our feelings of those emotions are what we experience. Our normal, traditional, or typical education is largely to blame for our estrangement. Most people are probably not conscious that our traditional education is overwhelmingly about our own particular group and thus tends to build a strong sense of identity with it, to the exclusion of other members of the human race who do not qualify for membership. Often in our thinking, often we demonize others, and ultimately that's where genocide comes from. Our past education is largely to blame for this, coming from our culture. So what if it were the opposite? Instead of the false ideas of who we are, us and them, we're replaced with just the knowledge of who we are. We could see each other as ourself, the same reality we know ourselves, we could see in the other. It will take a spiral curriculum. I'll explain more about that in a minute. We don't realize we see everything this way through an interpretation based on the past, including our worldview. It's time we look to the future based on present knowledge of who we are, instead of using all this built up erroneous information from our past. It colors everything. This knowledge base that's resident unconsciously in our brain, it taints everything we see and everything we think. We are condemned to repeat the errors of our fathers if we continue to think the way they did. We were created from the same dust, so no man would exalt himself above another. What if all the cultures were the what if instead all cultures were the inheritance of every child? How not see the history of everyone as his or her own history? What if pondering how you were created involved understanding that everyone is the product of one evolutionary life system and process? What if education science continually emphasized and reminded us of our interdependence, our oneness, and how we came to exist? What if the conceptions of unity and diversity became perceptions of the oneness of all life and one's place within the natural order and Earth ecosystem? This perceptual change is based on exploiting the findings from recent brain research, which has revealed how the visual system relies on bias, 60 to 1,000% more than it does the data impulses streaming along the neurons from the eyes. We see what we know. Now, this is really important. The visual system is the greatest analogy for understanding how all of our consciousness works, all of our ability to see even the world, not just the person standing in front of us that we may have some prejudice against or profiling. It's coming from all our past associations and memories built up, our prejudice from the past. Therefore, in the process is to replace this erroneous information and invalid experience with truth-based knowledge. I call it a science of reality. We replace the conception of oneness with the perception of oneness as a result. Here's my premise. Knowing myself as a human being before I know myself as a black or a white, an Arab or a Jew, a Christian or a Muslim, an American or a Chinese, male or female, will enable me to see the same reality as myself in others if I truly know myself, at least in the outward sense of how I came to exist through evolution and everything else. If so, then what is the knowledge of what it means to be human in the outward collective sense? And how do I obtain that knowledge and experience in a way that gives me the emotional sense of identity with all people, gives me the ability to see reality? And more importantly, how do we give this to the next generation, our children, so they grow up with it in their formative education so we don't actually have to transform adults? O children of men, know ye not why I created you all from the same dust? That no one should exalt himself over the other. Ponder at all times in your hearts how you were created. that from your inmost being, by your deeds and actions, the signs of oneness may be made manifest. So we could begin at the most simple level with physics in our schools to teach oneness, even through the beginnings of atomic structure, saying we come from stardust, we're all made of the same stuff. The principle of life illustrates unity and diversity. Every time you combine one more element, you create a unity. By that combination is a unity, and the unity creates another level of diversity. So unity and diversity is really easy to teach using the periodic table. And we could use the DNA science and help people understand that we are all the same from this perspective. We share our DNA that we share with everyone, 99.9% is the same. What if every child understood this as part of their basic education? We share about 14,000 genes with this acorn worm. Our DNA connects us to all the life on the planet. We share about 98% of our genes with chimpanzees, about 80 with these others, 80% of our genes with the cow, the rat, fish, platypus, even a bee and a crow. We share 50% of our genes with bananas. And about 26% of our housekeeping genes we share with these single cell organisms. This was kind of astounding. We share about 15% of our genes with grass and trees. Now these models and metaphors for our creation of humanity that we have in science were reflected a long time ago in the helix of Noah and Fuxi, who symbolically began life in the Chinese culture. Look at how similar these patterns are. Isn't that amazing? So our metaphors and symbolism comes from our unconscious as well. Carl Jung wrote a great book on man and his symbols and the archetypes that lie hidden in our unconscious. This helix also can be represented in the evolution of man, civilization coming into being, the evolution of all life on the planet Earth, one system, one life process. What if every child understood this through their K through 12 education? Would they not then see themselves as citizens of the world? What if every child saw the history of all people as his or own history, not his story? Not somebody else's story, but his story, his own story. We talk about educating the whole child, but to know what the whole child is, we have to look at the whole of humanity. Billions of years of process result in this creation, and we've all come through the same process. This is one of my neighbors in China. I lived in China for 3 years. He was my lumberyard guy. I loved this shirt he was wearing one day. He couldn't speak English, but we became great friends. The perception of oneness underlies world citizenship. This is my son when he was about 8 years old, studying Chinese in Beijing. The next few slides show receptive Chinese schools from my travel teaching experiences in China. I did PowerPoint presentations covering themes like these: global citizenship as the moral ethic of global competency, the new paradigm; oneness and diversity, the yin-yang of identity; seeing the reality of the other begins with self-knowledge; transforming unconscious bias to be positive; and our conception of oneness must become our perception of oneness. Discussing the consciousness of oneness as the prerequisite to world citizenship identity and as a new way of structuring the brain to see oneness, transcending prejudice, bias, and stereotyping. This was the theme at this conference where I spoke in Shanghai. You can see the slide of Confucius I showed you a moment ago. This was in Hangzhou, same message. Unity and diversity. This question and answer period took 3 hours. I couldn't believe it. These college students were so interested in this. Receptivity was high in universities and schools, but we only scratched the surface. I sensed that the students wanted to take action and to empower themselves to build a better world, but didn't know what steps they could do. And I'm going to ask you to join me in a new action today. This is a lecture at Zhejiang University, Graduate College of Education. Holistic education begins with self-knowledge. That's seeing the reality of the other begins with self-knowledge. This was in Zhuhai. Teaching Oneness in China, 2016 through 2019. Every child is potentially the light of the world, and at the same time, it's darkness. Therefore, education is of the greatest importance. How shall we acculturate the next generation? And why is a spiral curriculum required to develop this consciousness of oneness? For a child to know herself as a human being, she must first know what a human being is, which implies knowing or inheriting the entire history and cultures of all mankind, the biology of mankind, and how she came into being or came to exist. We call this knowing a comprehensive science of human reality. If, over the duration of the school experience, K through 12, the knowledge and understanding of what it means to be a human being outwardly deepens, it will be possible for a child to identify with the kind of archetypal reality of being human, in addition to expressing that natural diversity, love, and responsibility for, and commitment to the evolution of his or her own native culture and ethnicity inside the emerging global civilization. That child will have become a world citizen. This is the new knowledge that we have to do to oppose that false knowledge of prejudice and jingoism and xenophobia coming in from the culture. During the first generations of implementing this model, until the culture begins to change, the curriculum will necessarily spiral. That means it comes back every year and infused into all the courses at all times. And if it is to overcome this prejudice, ignorance, and false information, the child is constantly being fed from the culture. Loyalty to the human race will ensure that the knowledge in curriculum has the highest integrity to represent equality and justice. And that's it.